of. The number scratched into her father's ledger was $61, and Birch was worth every cent of it. At least, that's what Rupert Birch told himself when he pressed his thumb to the page. Men who know they're doing something shameful rarely do. The store smelled of sawdust, kerosene, and the particular sour sweetness of dried apples kept too long in a barrel. Outside, the Saskatchewan wind was doing what it always did in late September, throwing itself against every flat surface it could find, looking for something to break. Hazel stood with her hands folded in front of her, holding them still the way she'd learned to hold still in church, and watched her father sign her name over to a stranger. The stranger's name was Bram Collier. He was 41 years old, wide across the shoulders in the way of men who have moved heavy things for decades, with a jaw like a fence post and eyes the color of river ice, almost colorless, catching the light in a way that made them hard to read. His coat was oilskin, cracked along the left sleeve. He smelled of wood smoke, wet canvas, and something faintly medicinal, camphor, maybe, or pine tar. He didn't speak while her father explained her usefulness. He just stood with his arms crossed, listening, and looked at the middle distance above her father's head, as though the accounting of Hazel's skills. She can cook, she's strong, she doesn't complain much, was a weather report he was only mildly interested in. When her father finished, Bram reached into his coat, set a flat envelope on the counter, and said, "I'll bring the wagon around." That was it. That was the whole transaction. Hazel had 4 brothers and a mother who died of a burst appendix when Hazel was 12, and she had spent the 7 years since that death running the household while her father drank the farm into the ground one winter at a time. She was not surprised he'd sold her. She was not even particularly angry. What she felt standing in Dempsey's general store in Moorfield, Saskatchewan, with the envelope on the counter and Bram Collier's boots already crossing the threshold, was a dull, settling certainty. She picked up her carpet bag. It had belonged to her mother. Mrs. Dempsey, behind the counter, offered her a look of such careful, curated pity that Hazel wanted to tip over the nearest barrel of oats. She didn't. She walked out into the cold instead. The wagon was already at the hitching post. 2 dark bay horses, thick-legged and serious, stood without moving while the wind pulled at their manes. Bram was checking the lashings on the canvas over the wagon bed. He didn't offer her a hand up. Hazel climbed onto the buckboard herself. The wood was ice-cold through her skirt. She set her bag between her feet, pulled her coat tighter at the collar, and stared at the road north. Bram climbed up, gathered the reins, and they left Moorfield without a word spoken between them. She learned several things in the first hour of that ride. First, Bram Collier was not a talker. The silence came off him the way cold comes off a stone wall, a steady, total, and not personal. Second, the road north into the Clearwater Hills was not, technically speaking, a road. It was 2 ruts in the earth that the frost was doing its best to erase. Third, he had 4 children. He told her this somewhere in the second hour, unprompted, his eyes fixed on the tree line. 4, he said. Oldest is 11, youngest is 3. Their mother died 14 months ago. What did she die of? Hazel asked. He was quiet for a long moment. She went through the ice. Hazel didn't say she was sorry. It seemed, from the angle of his jaw, like a thing he'd heard enough times. She looked back at the road. What are their names? He told her. The oldest was a boy named Quentin, then 2 girls. Sunniva, who was 8, and Blythe, who was 6. The 3-year-old was another boy. They called him Pip because his real name, Phineas, was too much for a child that small. Hazel repeated them in her head. Quentin, Sunniva, Blythe, Pip. "Are they expecting me?" she asked. Something passed across Bram's face. It wasn't quite discomfort. Quentin is. She understood what that meant. Quentin was expecting her and had opinions about it. The others likely had no idea she was coming, because what do you tell a 3-year-old? A woman is coming to live with us because I can't manage 4 children and 200 acres of boreal scrubland alone. You don't tell them anything. You just drive home and let reality present itself. The homestead appeared as the sun dropped behind the tree line, painting everything in shades of bruised copper and cold shadow. The cabin was larger than she'd expected. 2 full stories, log-built, with a stone chimney exhaling a thin thread of smoke. A barn stood behind it, and past the barn, a smokehouse with a rusted tin roof, and past that, The land just ran on until the spruce forest swallowed it whole. Before the wagon stopped, the front door opened. Quentin stood in the doorway. He was 11 years old and had clearly appointed himself the authority in his father's absence. He held himself with that particular brittle stiffness of a boy who has been keeping things together through sheer willpower for longer than he should have had to. His hair was the same pale color as his father's eyes. He looked at Hazel from the porch with an expression that was not hostile exactly. It was something more calculated than hostility. It was assessment. Behind him, a small face peered around his arm. That would be Blythe, 6 years old, dark-haired, watching with wide, careful eyes. Then Suniva appeared at the window, pressing her nose to the glass. Pip was nowhere in sight. "Is that her?" Quentin called out. "That's her," Bram said, climbing down. "She's small," Quentin said. "I can hear you," Hazel said. She was already off the wagon, her bag in hand, walking toward the porch. "I'm not small. The porch is tall." Quentin looked at her with narrowed eyes. He stepped back, but didn't open the door any wider. Hazel put her hand on the door and pushed. The smell hit her before the sight did. Not as violent as she'd feared, but unmistakably the smell of a house where no woman had lived for over a year. Old cooking fat, stale wood ash, unwashed wool, and the particular staleness of rooms where windows don't get opened. The kitchen, if it could be called that, had the look of a place managed by someone doing their determined best and losing, dishes stacked unevenly. A pot of something gray and congealed, sitting on the back of the stove. Kindling piled directly on the table. 3 different sizes of boot, caked with frozen mud, arranged in no particular order by the door. In the corner near the hearth, Pip sat inside a wooden wash tub he was apparently using as a fort, chewing on a piece of harness leather. Hazel set her bag on the kitchen table next to the kindling. She looked around the room for a long moment. She looked at Quentin, who was watching her from the doorway with his arms crossed, waiting for her to flinch or flee or make some declaration of horror. She looked at Blythe, who had followed her in and was now standing very close to her right elbow. She looked at Pip in his wash tub. She took her coat off, folded it over the back of a chair, and said, "All right, who's going to show me where the water comes from?" Quentin didn't move. Why? "Because that pot on the stove needs to be dealt with before it becomes something we'd have to bury," Hazel said, "and I'm going to need water to deal with it." Blythe raised her hand, very slightly as if they were in school. "I know where the pump is." "Good," Hazel said. "Show me." That was how it started. The first week was not a war. It was a siege. Quentin did not throw things or make overt sabotage. He was smarter than that. He simply withheld. He didn't answer questions directly. He disappeared for hours at a time to the barn and came back with the air of someone who has been checking on something important that you couldn't possibly understand. He gave Hazel the kind of cooperation that is technically cooperation and nothing more. He would do exactly what she asked, and not one single thing beyond it, and he would do it with an expression of patient suffering that made her want to put her head through the window. Suniva was a watcher. She observed Hazel from doorways and around corners with the focused attention of a naturalist studying an unfamiliar species. She didn't speak much, but Hazel caught her helping. Once, quietly sweeping the kitchen floor when she thought no one was looking, then stopping the moment she heard footsteps. Blythe was simply lonely. She followed Hazel around the cabin with a tenacity that would have been exhausting if it hadn't been so obviously desperate. She asked questions constantly, about everything. Why Hazel braided her hair that way, what her mother's name had been, did she know how to make proper pie crust, could she whistle, had she ever seen the ocean, what did she think about wolves, and Pip. Pip was 3. He had no opinions about the situation. He was willing to be carried and would fall asleep in her lap if she sat still for more than 10 minutes, which, in those first raw weeks, was more comfort than Hazel would have admitted to anyone. Bram left before light and came back after dark. He ran a trap line and worked part of his land for timber contracts, the operation of 2 men. Hazel realized quickly, being run by one. He ate what she left for him on the back of the stove, and twice in that first week she woke past midnight to find him sitting at the kitchen table with a kerosene lamp and a sheaf of figures, working through something with the quiet grimness of a man solving a problem that keeps changing the rules. She didn't speak to him. She went back to bed. What nobody told her was how physical it would be. Not in the way of hardship stories where difficulty is romantic and suffering has clean lines. In the actual, daily, grinding physical reality of it. The water pump froze every night and had to be thawed every morning with a kettle of hot water before anything else could happen. The wood box held enough for maybe 6 hours of fire and needed constant refilling. The root cellar stairs were a single misstep away from catastrophe. The stove was large and temperamental, burning too hot or not enough, and the flue needed clearing twice that first month. Her hands cracked in the dry air. She went through 2 pairs of wool socks in the first 2 weeks. She was 23 years old and had not chosen any of this. On the worst days, she stood at the kitchen window and looked at the tree line and thought about her mother's carpet bag sitting in the corner of the room they'd given her. She thought about Moorfield. She thought about the envelope on the counter. Then she turned back to the stove because the porridge was burning. The cold deepened through October and into November. The nights were brutal, below -30, and the cabin, for all its solidity, breathed cold in through every seam. Hazel learned to bank the fire in a specific way that kept coals alive until morning, learned which windows needed stuffing with rags along the sill, learned that the drafts came mostly from the northeast corner of the kitchen, where the chinking had gone soft. It was Quentin who noticed her learning. She didn't realize it until the morning she came downstairs to find the wood box full. Not just topped off, but genuinely full, stacked with the kind of care that meant someone had thought about it. When she looked at Quentin over breakfast, he looked very deliberately at his porridge. She didn't say thank you. She understood somehow that acknowledging it directly would be the wrong move. She just made sure the next batch of porridge had brown sugar on top, the way he liked it, without him having to ask. That was the beginning of the negotiation. The ice broke in early December, and not from the cold. Hazel was at the stove when she heard Suneva's voice from the loft, thin and strange. Not crying, not quite. She climbed the ladder and found the girl sitting up in bed with both arms wrapped around her knees, shaking in fine, rapid shivers. Her face was flushed red and her eyes were glassy, not a chill. Hazel pressed the back of her hand to Suneva's forehead. The heat coming off the child was significant. "How long have you felt like this?" Hazel asked. "Since last night," Suneva whispered. "Why didn't you say something?" Suneva looked at her with those careful watching eyes, even now, sick and shaking. "I didn't want to bother you." That landed somewhere Hazel didn't have a name for. She pushed it aside. "Come downstairs." "I need you by the fire." Bram was gone. He'd be gone for 3 days, a run to the far end of the trapline with an overnight stop. Quentin stood in the kitchen doorway, watching Hazel move Suneva to the chair nearest the hearth, and his face had lost all its careful composure. He looked 8 years old instead of 11. "Is it like?" he started. "No," Hazel said. She didn't know that yet, but she said it without hesitation, because he needed her to. "It's a fever. We'll bring it down." She knew what to do with a fever from watching her mother work through her brother's childhood sicknesses. She boiled water with wild ginger root she found in the back of the pantry, added a spoonful of honey, and got it into Suneva in small doses. She stripped away the heavy blankets that were trapping heat against the child's skin and replaced them with a single light quilt. She dragged the rocking chair to within arm's reach of the fire and settled in. Quentin hauled water. He did it without being asked, simply disappeared and came back with the bucket full twice, and then a third time. He kept the fire going through the night with a steadiness that spoke of practice. When Blythe woke and crept downstairs frightened, he was the one who took her back to bed, and Hazel heard his voice from the loft, low and even, telling his sister something she couldn't make out. The fever broke near dawn. Suneva fell into a deep, natural sleep, her breathing smooth. Hazel was still in the rocking chair when she heard the front door. The cold rushed in, and then Bram was there, snow on his shoulders, smelling of spruce and frozen air. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. His eyes went to Suneva asleep in the chair, then to Quentin asleep on the rug with one arm tucked under his head, then to Hazel. She looked back at him. She felt 70 years old and made of something that had been compressed over a very long time into a much smaller, denser thing. "She had a fever," Hazel said. Her voice came out lower than she intended. "It broke around 4. She'll be fine by tomorrow." Bram stood still in the doorway for a moment that stretched. He walked into the room, moving carefully so as not to wake either child. He stood over Sniva and put one large hand very gently on her forehead, just for a second. Then he straightened. He looked at Hazel. His face was not a readable document. It was never a readable document. But something in it had shifted, a seam in the stone wall, barely visible, but there. He reached out and set his hand briefly on top of Hazel's, where it rested on the arm of the chair, and pressed down just once, warm and rough and certain. "Go lie down," he said quietly. "I've got them." Hazel went. She lay on her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and felt the weight of his hand on hers like a coal she'd been carrying a long time without knowing it was warm. February was a different country. The worst of the cold had a clarity to it, almost beautiful in its total commitment. The spruce trees cracked in the nights. The snow on the flat fields had a dry, crystalline quality that picked up the light and turned it sharp. They had settled into something. Not quite a family, not quite an arrangement, something that didn't have a clean word, but had the weight of a shared winter. Quentin had stopped treating her like a weather event he was waiting to pass. He asked her once about canning, a careful, roundabout kind of asking, where the question arrived, wrapped in observations about the pantry rather than asked directly. Hazel told him what she knew. He listened. He remembered. He applied it. She didn't make a production of it. Suniva began sitting near her in the evenings, just near. Not touching, not talking always, just occupying the same side of the room with a quiet trust that Hazel didn't want to examine too carefully for fear of disturbing it. Blythe learned to braid hair by practicing on Hazel, which resulted in some structures that were more architectural than useful, and Hazel wore every single one of them without complaint. Pip had simply accepted her presence completely, the way small children accept furniture, as a fixed feature of the landscape. He climbed into her lap at regular intervals and went to sleep, and Hazel had given up, pretending this didn't matter to her. Bram was still a closed door, but closed doors can have light under them. She noticed things. He left the good axe where she could reach it. He checked the chinking on the northeast corner in November without her saying anything about the draft. He brought back 2 yards of flannel from the Moorfield store once without explanation, and she understood it was for the children's winter things when she found it on the kitchen table, folded neatly with the receipt tucked underneath. Not her money, his. No comment offered. They talked in the evening sometimes, short practical exchanges. The trapline numbers, the price of timber, which of the horses needed shoeing. But sometimes something else crept in. She told him once about her mother. The way she'd kept a kitchen garden even through the dry years, stubborn as anything, coaxing beans from cracked earth. He listened. Then he said that his father had been the same way. And that was all he said. But he didn't go back to his figures. March arrived, and with it came mud and the smell of thaw, and Bram said they needed to go to Moorfield for supplies. Hazel thought about what that meant. She thought about Moorfield the way you think about a room you've left behind. Familiar, already slightly unreal. She thought about her father, somewhere in that town, and the ledger at Dempsey's store. The wagon ride down was nothing like the ride up. Blythe was wedged between her and Bram on the buckboard, demanding to know the name of every tree they passed. Quentin sat in the back with his boots dangling, doing something with a length of cord. A trap knot. Hazel had learned to recognize the shape of his concentration when it was something he'd taught himself. Pip was asleep against Quentin's leg. The sun was thin but present, and the road was running mud, and Hazel could feel the solid warmth of Bram's arm against her shoulder when the wagon jostled. Neither of them moved away. Moorfield looked the same. Of course it did. Towns like Moorfield don't change, they accumulate. The wagon pulled up to Dempsey's and Hazel climbed down before Bram had set the brake. She pushed through the door. The bell above it rang. The same bell, the same sawdust. The same Mr. Dempsey behind the counter. He looked up. His face went through 3 or 4 things in quick succession. Hazel. He seemed to have decided on cautious pleasantness. We didn't expect. Your father was asking after 20 pounds of flour, Hazel said. Rolled oats, the large sack, 6 tins of tomatoes. I need to see what you have for boiled wool. Pip's grown out of his coat. Dempsey's wife was at the far end of the counter, pretending to inventory the thread display. She had told 3 people Hazel knew that Bram Collier would have that Birch girl sent back by Christmas. She had said it with the particular sad confidence of a woman who prides herself on knowing how things go. Hazel took the list she'd written out of her coat pocket and set it on the counter. The bell rang again. Bram came through the door, with Pip on his arm, the boy still half asleep and listing against his father's shoulder like a small, boneless thing he didn't speak of. He walked to stand behind Hazel, not beside her, behind her, and the width of him in the doorway rearranged the light in the room. He set the coin purse on the counter next to Hazel's list and put his hand briefly at the small of her back, the same hand that had covered hers in the early morning after Suneva's fever, warm, certain. He had nothing to say to Dempsey. He just looked at him. Dempsey looked at the list. Then at Bram. Then at the list again. He started filling the order. Mrs. Dempsey had stopped pretending to count thread. Hazel picked up a tin of tomatoes and read the label with the focused attention of someone who has already won and doesn't need to prove it. She could feel Bram behind her like a wall at her back, and she could feel Mrs. Dempsey across the room doing frantic internal calculations about where she'd gone wrong in her predictions. Good, Hazel thought. Let her recalculate. When they left the store, Blythe was waiting outside on the wagon wheel hub, having eaten her way through a paper sack of peppermint drops Bram had apparently acquired at some point. She offered Hazel one. Hazel took it. Quentin was leaning against the wagon reading a handbill someone had stuck to the post with studied disinterest, and Pip was now fully awake and trying to pull a button off Bram's coat. They loaded the wagon. The drive back into the Clearwater Hills began with Blythe falling asleep within 20 minutes, her head dropping onto Hazel's arm. Hazel didn't move her arm. He looked at the spruce forests coming back to meet them, the long shadows falling across the ruts in the mud, the sky going pale gold and then pink over the ridge. "She asked me last week," Bram said, after a long quiet. "Who asked you what?" "Blythe." He kept his eyes on the road. "She asked if you were going to stay." The wind moved through the tops of the spruce trees. Pip had found a stone from somewhere and was banging it against the side of the wagon in a slow, satisfied rhythm. "What did you tell her?" Hazel asked. Bram was quiet for a moment, not the silence of avoidance, the silence of a man choosing language carefully. "I told her," he said slowly. "That was something we'd have to ask you properly." Hazel felt the weight of Blythe's head on her arm. She felt the cold of the early spring air, and the heat from Bram's side, and the swaying of the wagon on the road home. Home, she noticed she had thought, home, and looked at the hills going dark ahead of them. "Ask me then," she said. He looked at her. The pale gray eyes that she had learned in these months were not hollow at all. They were just careful. There was a difference. "Will you stay?" he said. Below them in the valley, the cabin windows were dark, waiting for the fire to be lit. The smoke would come from the chimney in an hour. The wood box would need filling. Suneva had asked that morning whether Hazel knew how to make the apple cake her grandmother had made, and Hazel had said she didn't know, but she'd figure it out, and Suneva had nodded, like this was both expected and sufficient. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was mud season in Saskatchewan and 4 children who needed things, and a man who'd handed her a list of flour and looked away when she'd picked up her coat. It was cracked knuckles and the smell of wood smoke in her hair and the particular exhaustion that settles into your bones when you've done something real. It was hers. "Yes," Hazel said. "I'll stay." Bram turned back to the road. He didn't smile, not quite. But the corners of his eyes creased, the same small thing she'd learned to read the way you learn to read weather. He clicked his tongue at the horses. They leaned into the traces, and the wagon rolled on, up into the hills, toward the cold and the fire and everything waiting to be made into a life.